The air inside the barracks was heavy with the smells of sweat, damp wood, and hunger. It was not just the absence of food that weighed on them, but also the constant fear. Each day followed the same pattern: roll call, waiting, meager rations, and silence. Outside the wire, the world was ending. Inside, time seemed frozen, stretching across empty stomachs and growing weaker voices. By the summer of 1945, Japanese prisoners of war were scattered across the Pacific in hastily constructed American camps. Most were men, but in a few remote locations there were also women, nurses, clerks, and communications auxiliaries who had been captured when garrisons collapsed. They were rare and almost invisible in official reports, but they existed. In one camp, their survival was a question of days, not weeks. The guards were not cruel, they were overwhelmed. Supplies reached the island sporadically, carried by convoys that risked both submarines and storms. When food arrived, it was stacked in warehouses, counted and divided before being carried in sacks to the camps. The maths were simple: soldiers came first, prisoners second. By the time the women received their portion, it had dwindled to a handful of rice, a bowl of watery soup, or a piece of torn bread. They learned to chew slowly and press the food against their tongues, as if the taste alone could feed them. At mealtimes, they watched each other's faces, noting how their cheeks hollowed, their lips cracked, and their eyes sank deeper into their sockets. Some whispered at night, wondering who would be next to collapse. Others fell silent, as though speaking would cost them too much strength. Among them was a woman in her early 20s. She had once been a nurse, trained in Tokyo, and posted to a garrison hospital. She was captured when the American advance overran the island. Her uniform had been reduced to rags, but her habits had not vanished. She moved from woman to woman, checking fevers with her palm, rationing water, and urging others to swallow, even when the food in their mouths turned to paste. The others thought her reckless. She never hid her defiance. Even when speaking in whispers, she spoke louder than most dared to. It was hunger that brought about the moment. One day, when it was hotter than usual, the air shimmering and sweat rolling down even the guards' backs, a truck rumbled into the compound. Dust rose around its wheels. In the back were sacks containing grain, canned goods, and other precious supplies. The prisoners stirred, their eyes fixed on the truck. Hope and fear mingled in their throats. The guards began unloading, moving slowly but deliberately, and stacking the sacks in the shade. The distribution would follow the usual pattern. A few small bowls would be handed out under watch, each one carefully measured. But that day, something broke. The nurse, thin, with matted hair and a hollow face, but fierce eyes, stepped forward. The others hissed at her to stop. "Don't move! Don't draw attention! You'll be punished!" But she did not stop. She walked straight towards the guards, her steps uneven yet determined. They turned, their rifles shifting slightly, and their hands tightening. Everyone inside the barracks froze. She reached the pile of sacks and did the unthinkable. She grabbed one. Her arms trembled under the weight, but she pulled it close and clutched it against her chest. For a moment, time stood still. Guards shouted. Prisoners gasped. Some thought she had gone insane. Then she turned and staggered back towards the women, falling to her knees. Tearing the sack open with her bare hands, she allowed the rice to spill into the dirt. The women gasped again, but she ignored them. She began scooping the grain into smaller piles and pushing portions towards each woman around her. Her hands shook. Her face was streaked with sweat. But her voice was steady as she said, "Eat. All of you. Eat now." The guards did not fire. They did not strike her. They stood in shock, rifles raised but frozen. One sergeant barked an order, but another held out his hand to stop him. For a moment the only sounds were the hiss of rice falling from her hands into the dust and the faint sobs of women who were too stunned to move. It was madness. To challenge authority and seize food in front of armed men was madness. But it was also clarity. Her crazy act revealed the truth that no one dared to speak. Starvation was killing them faster than war. Rules could not fill their stomachs. Fear could not keep them alive. Only courage, reckless and defiant, could tip the scales back in their favor. The women stared at her, some terrified and some awed. A few of them crawled forward and scooped up the rice with shaking fingers, stuffing it into their mouths before it could fall back into the dirt. The guards watched, and one finally muttered under his breath, too quietly for anyone but the soldier nearest to him to hear, "Let her finish." And so she did. In that instant, the camp changed. The prisoners realized that sometimes survival required madness. The Americans realized that mercy could emerge from chaos, and the young nurse, drenched in sweat and kneeling in the dust, became the embodiment of both. Sometimes history shifts not with armies, but with a single, seemingly insane act that saves lives. The world did not expect to see Japanese women behind barbed wire. In the Pacific War, prisoners of war were usually men, soldiers pulled from trenches, sailors dragged from sinking ships, and airmen captured after parachuting into the jungle. Women were rarely taken alive. Japanese propaganda had instilled in them the creed of Gyokusai, to die like shattered jewels rather than accept captivity. Surrender was dishonorable. To live as a prisoner was worse than death. Yet, in the final year of the war, reality overcame ideology. American advances swept through the islands faster than the garrisons could fight to the last man. Civilians were caught up in the conflict. Nurses, clerks, and communication auxiliaries who had been assigned to military outposts found themselves trapped. For the first time, American forces encountered Japanese women as prisoners of war. The camps were never prepared for them. The U.S. Army had protocols for male prisoners and strict guidelines from the Geneva Conventions, but nothing anticipated groups of female captives from an enemy who claimed not to have any. The women were placed in makeshift barracks, surrounded by wire strung between wooden posts, and guarded by men who were as weary as they were watchful. Food was scarce everywhere in 1945. Allied troops were also short of supplies, surviving on sea rations that had been carried across the ocean. The rations for prisoners were even smaller. Every calorie was counted, measured, and allocated. Rice was the most valuable commodity, but convoys carrying sacks of it were targeted by submarines. Sometimes shipments arrived weeks late, the grain crawling with weevils and half-rotten, but still edible. Canned goods were rare treasures, usually reserved for the guards before the prisoners. The result was a constant feeling of hunger for the prisoners. Conditions inside the barracks were harsh. Straw mats lay on damp floors crawling with insects. Rain leaked through the tin roofs and pooled in muddy puddles in the corners. Disease spread quickly in such places: dysentery, beriberi, and malaria. American doctors who visited the camps wrote notes that still survive in archives. Prisoners, especially females, are underweight by 20-30 pounds, skin lesions visible, general malnutrition acute. The language was clinical, but the reality was stark. The women were starving. Water was rationed too. A single barrel filled at dawn had to last an entire day. Women lined up with dented cups and broken bottles, waiting for a ladle of muddy liquid with a taste of rust. Some whispered prayers before drinking, hoping to stave off sickness. Others cupped their hands and drank straight from puddles of rainwater, ignoring the filth. What made the suffering worse was the silence. The women had been trained never to complain. Even in captivity, they moved with rigid discipline, bowing at roll call, sitting in rows and speaking only in whispers. The guards noted this with surprise. One American sergeant wrote, "They hardly speak. They sit with their backs straight, even when they can barely hold their heads up. They don't beg, but their eyes give them away." Rare reports of Japanese female prisoners of war from the International Red Cross confirm this atmosphere. Delegates who visited noted the absence of protests. Instead of petitions, They found women sitting in silence, their bodies revealing what their voices could not. Ribs pressing against skin, lips cracked from thirst, and dimmed eyes revealing exhaustion. Among them were nurses who had once worked in military hospitals. Their training had taught them to keep others alive, even when their own health was failing. They improvised medicine from scraps, boiled leaves to treat fevers, washed and reused rags as bandages, and soft songs to lift spirits. Yet even nurses could not conjure food from nothing. Hunger ate through discipline, willpower, and pride. The Americans, for their part, were not cruel, just constrained. Supplies had to be stretched across entire armies. Guard units often ate little better than the prisoners they guarded. Some quietly shared their own rations, slipping biscuits through the barbed wire or dropping chocolate bars on the ground by accident. But these gestures could not solve the scale of the problem. Starvation remained constant. The psychology of captivity was a burden in itself. The women had been told that surrendering was worse than dying. Now they were experiencing it firsthand. They feared the judgment of their homeland and the silence of their families, who might never know that they were still alive. Some prayed daily for the war to end, not for victory, but simply so that their shame could be resolved. Others clung to their sense of duty, pledging allegiance to the emperor even as hunger racked their bodies. It was into this fragile balance that the young nurse stepped, whose actions would change everything. To understand why her crazy decision mattered, you must grasp the weight bearing down on them all: the empty bowls, the endless waiting, and the knowledge that death by starvation would be silent, without battle or honor, and without even the dignity of being remembered. In the summer heat, hunger turned to desperation, and when desperation is concentrated in one determined person, it can ignite into defiance. This was the world of the camp, a place of silence, discipline, and slow death, where one reckless act of courage could tip the balance in favor of survival. She was not the strongest among them. Her frame was thin even before captivity, and months of meager rations had carved her body down to bone. Yet her presence filled the barracks. The other women whispered that she was different, even strange. Not because she was loud, her voice was quiet but steady. Not because she was reckless, though some called her that. It was because she carried something that most of them had already lost: the refusal to collapse into silence. Her name has been preserved in the notes of American officers and the memories of fellow prisoners, but it has been recorded in fragments, half erased by history. Before her capture, she had been a nurse, trained in Tokyo at a time when young women in uniform were presented as symbols of national duty. Her instructors taught her the language of medicine, but also the language of sacrifice. Serve the soldiers, serve the emperor, and endure without question. She carried that discipline into the war. Stationed at a garrison hospital on a Pacific island, she worked through endless nights of blood and fever, changing bandages, cleaning wounds, and whispering words of encouragement to men coughing out their last breaths. However, when the American landing came, she was swept along with hundreds of others in the tide of battle. The hospital collapsed. She and a few other members of staff were captured, loaded onto trucks, and taken behind barbed wire. Captivity did not erase her instincts. In the camp, she took temperatures, listened for shallow breathing, and dressed sores. She walked from woman to woman, urging them to eat, even when their stomachs turned at the thought of the thin soup. When water was scarce, she gave her own portion to the weakest woman. The others thought her strange. Why waste strength on gestures that could not change fate? But to her, they were not a waste. It was a different kind of survival. Those who remembered her later described her eyes first. They weren't defiant like soldiers, but they had a spark that made even fellow prisoners uneasy. One person said, "She looked at you as if you couldn't give up even if you wanted to." Another said, "She smiled when there was nothing to smile about. That made her frightening." She had a habit of humming fragments of songs from her training days under her breath while working. The sound was barely audible, but in the silent barracks it carried. Some found it comforting, others found it unnerving, like a reminder of a world that no longer existed. The guards noticed her too. She never bowed as deeply as the others. She moved with a directness that drew attention. Once, when a soldier shouted at her to sit down, she obeyed slowly, never taking her eyes off him. It was a small gesture, but the women saw it. It was a refusal to surrender completely, even within the confines of captivity. Hunger gnawed at everyone, but she bore it differently. While others curled up to conserve energy, she stayed active, checking on the sick and encouraging them to sip water, chew slowly, and stay awake. At night, when whispers of despair filled the barracks, she responded with brief replies, "Not yet, not tonight." Some thought her foolish, some admired her. Everyone recognized that she was different. Her courage bordered on madness. It was this quality, the fine line between defiance and insanity, that would shape what came next. In the eyes of her fellow prisoners, she became both a warning and a beacon. "She is reckless," they whispered. "She will bring punishment on all of us." Yet, in the same breath, "She is brave. She may be the reason we live another day." In truth, she did not see herself as brave. Later accounts suggest that she simply acted as she always had. In hospitals, hesitation cost lives. In camps, hesitation cost hope. For her, the difference was small. To stop moving, to stop acting, was to accept death. That she refused to do. So she waited, silent but watchful, until hunger threatened to kill faster than bullets. That was when she would unveil her so-called crazy act. To the others it seemed reckless, dangerous, and insane. To her, however, it was the only sane choice left. Sometimes history remembers generals and battles. Sometimes it remembers the nameless faces in the crowd. Here, however, history turned on one woman who refused to bow down completely, who sang songs in the dark and carried the spark of defiance into a place built to extinguish it. The day began like every other, with the heat pressing down on the barracks and the women moving slowly, their steps heavy and their voices barely above a whisper. Hunger was no longer just an ache. It was a constant presence, wrapping around every thought and dulling every movement. Some women stared at the dirt floor for hours, too weak to get up. Others clutched their ribs as if trying to hold themselves together. The nurse walked among them, urging them to sit up straight, sip water, and cling to life. Her own body was frail, but her movements were urgent, as though she were waiting for a storm. The sound of an engine broke the monotony. Dust billowed as a truck rolled into the compound, its wheels groaning over uneven ground. The women lifted their heads, narrowing their eyes against the sun. In the back of the truck were sacks containing grain and rations, the things they dreamed of every night. Hope flickered, but so did dread. They knew the pattern. The supplies would be unloaded, stacked, and measured. The portions would shrink as they passed from guard to guard. By the time the food reached the women, there would barely be enough to dull their hunger for a few hours. The guards began unloading. Sweat dripped down their faces as they heaved the sacks onto the ground. The prisoners gathered in a loose line, swaying as they stood and staring at the grain as if hypnotized. The air felt heavier than ever, thick with expectation and despair. Then she moved. The nurse, frail yet steady, broke away from the group. The women gasped and hissed her name, pleading with her to stop. "Don't do this. They will punish us. They will kill you." But she kept walking, her bare feet kicking up dust and her back straight despite her exhaustion. The guards took note. Rifles shifted and bayonets glinted in the light. A sergeant barked a sharp, quick command. She did not pause. She reached the pile of sacks, bent down, and drawing on a strength not from her body, but from desperation, lifted one. The fabric strained in her grip as the grain shifted inside. For a moment, the entire camp froze. Taking food in front of armed guards was unthinkable. To seize it openly would be madness. The women held their breath, waiting for the strike, the shot, or the scream. Some buried their faces in their hands, unwilling to witness what they believed would be her death. But she did not stop. She turned, the sack pressed against her chest, her steps unsteady yet determined. Each footfall echoed in the silence. The guards shouted again, louder this time. One raised his rifle, another held up a hand, stopping him. Sweat poured down the nurse's face as she walked on, her knees threatening to buckle under the weight. She reached the women and fell to her knees. Dust rose around her, clinging to her skin. With trembling fingers, she tore open the sack, ripping the coarse fabric until rice spilled out in a cascade of white grains. Gasps rose from the prisoners. Some tried to pull her back, whispering frantically, "Stop, stop, you'll doom us all." She ignored them. Her hand scooped up the rice and pushed it into small piles across the dirt. "Eat," she said in a low, steady voice. "All of you, eat now." The women hesitated, their eyes darting between her and the guards. Fear and hunger were evident in their faces. One of them finally reached forward, her hand trembling, and took a small handful. She shoved it into her mouth and began to chew, despite the dryness. Tears streamed down her face as she swallowed. Another woman followed, then another. Soon the women were crouched around the sack, scooping rice with their bare hands and pressing it to their lips. Their cheeks were wet with relief and terror. The guards did not fire. They stood frozen, uncertain. One sergeant cursed under his breath. Another muttered, almost reluctantly, "Let her finish." The rifles lowered slightly, though their eyes never left the scene. The battle-hardened Americans had expected the prisoners to obey silently. They had not expected such defiance, which carried no malice, only desperation. They did not see an enemy soldier, but a gaunt woman kneeling in the dirt and giving away food that she could have kept for herself, dividing it into tiny portions. Madness, yes, but also something deeper. The silence was broken only by the sound of grain falling and the muffled sobs of women eating, as if it were the first real food they had ever tasted. The nurse's hands moved quickly, ignoring the cuts and bruises she sustained and the shouts of fear around her. She tore at the sack relentlessly, scooping and dividing the food. She did not eat. For the prisoners, it was beyond their understanding. They had been taught obedience, submission, and silence. She broke all of that in seconds. Defying the guards, seizing food, and risking punishment was insane, and yet it was also salvation. Once the rice had been divided up, the women sat in a rough circle and ate in silence, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. The guards stood still, their rifles lowered, and the moment slipped from discipline into mercy. The nurse remained on her knees, her chest heaving and her hands raw from tearing fabric. She looked at the women around her, not at the soldiers. Her task was complete. Later, one of the guards whispered, "She was crazy." Another answered, "Crazy, but right." And it was in this fragile balance between defiance and compassion that dozens of lives shifted from the brink of death back towards survival. Silence fell, heavier than gunfire. Rice lay scattered on the ground, and women crouched over it, their hands trembling as they ate. The dust clung to the grains, but no one cared. They swallowed quickly, some sobbed, some coughed, afraid the food might disappear if they hesitated. Hunger had erased shame. The only thing that mattered was that for the first time in days, their stomachs were no longer empty. The guards stood rigidly, their rifles half lowered and their boots planted firmly in the dirt. They had expected chaos, or perhaps even rebellion. Instead, they witnessed something even stranger. There was no attack, no riot, and no attempt to escape. Only women huddled in the dirt, clutching handfuls of rice as if they were treasure. The sergeant's voice cut through the stillness once, barking a command to stop. But the sound carried no force. The women did not even look up. They were too deeply engaged in the act of survival. The nurse remained on her knees, her chest rising and falling, her fingers raw from tearing the sack. She did not eat. Her eyes followed the others as they pressed the food to their mouths, and color returned faintly to their faces. That was enough for her. Around her, the women whispered through mouthfuls of rice, "She's mad. She saved us. She'll be punished. She gave us life." Their words were a tangled mix of awe and terror. For the Americans, the moment was disorienting. They had been trained to see prisoners as a burden and as mere numbers on ration sheets. But this act forced them to see individuals. One gaunt woman had risked punishment not to take food for herself, but to share it with others. Madness, they thought. Yet amid the madness there was clarity. A corporal muttered under his breath, "She's crazy." The sergeant beside him replied quietly, "Crazy, but brave." The tension stretched on for what felt like hours. The rifles remained in the soldiers' hands, but their barrels were pointing closer to the ground than to the women. One of the guards shifted his weight, as though he were about to step forward and seize the nurse. Instead, the officer in charge raised his hand and stopped him. His order was simple: let her finish. Those words changed the atmosphere. It gave the act legitimacy. The women realized that they would not be punished for eating. Their fear eased, replaced by frantic relief. They scooped up more rice, pressing it into their mouths with trembling hands. Some even gathered scraps from the ground. A few shared with infants who were too weak to cry. The babies suckled at their sticky fingers and their eyes fluttered open. No punishment came, no blows were landed. Instead, the guards stood in silence, watching as hunger was defeated not by discipline, but by defiance. The moment was fragile and surreal. Soldiers who had seen men charge machine guns now witnessed women weeping over grains of rice. The weight of war shifted. The nurse sat back, her face streaked with sweat and her hands falling limply into her lap. She still did not eat. She seemed to have no more strength, but her eyes glimmered with a strange satisfaction. With nothing more than a reckless act, she had forced life back into the camp. For the other prisoners, the effect was more profound than the food itself. It shattered the logic of silence. They had been taught to obey and endure in silence. Her act showed that resistance could take another form, not violence, but survival. Some still whispered that she was insane, but others began to call her something else, the one who gave us a chance. That night the barracks were different. Women lay on mats with empty, but no longer hollow, stomachs. A few hummed quietly, echoing the tune that the nurse often sang under her breath. Guards paced outside, their shadows sliding across the barbed wire fence, but their rifles were held lower than before. They had seen something that had unsettled them, an enemy who was willing to risk her life, not to fight, but to feed them. The Americans reported the incident in clipped official language. A note in a log read, "Unusual disturbance during ration distribution. Female prisoner of war seized supply sack and distributed it to others. No violence. Situation stabilized." Although the words were sterile, those who were there never forgot the scene. One soldier wrote privately, "We've seen men fight to the death for flags, for orders, for glory. Today, we saw a woman fight for rice. I don't know which is braver." In the camp, the women whispered long into the night. They did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in weeks, they could sense the faint pulse of possibility. Hunger still pressed upon them, but hope had arrived alongside it. Sometimes the loudest act in war is silence. The silence after an irrational act, when no shots are fired, no punishment is given, and survival, against all odds, is permitted. The morning after the incident, the camp felt different. The guards walked their rounds, their boots crunching against the gravel, but they lingered longer than before on the barracks. They had witnessed the consequences of desperation when given a voice. The torn sack of rice lay on the ground, its fabric ripped and stained with scattered grains that the women had picked up one by one in the dark. Nothing in the camp had changed structurally. The wire was still standing, the rifles still gleamed, and the barracks still smelt of sweat and damp wood. Yet the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer silence built only on fear. Now it was a silence built on memory, of a woman kneeling in the dust with raw hands, forcing survival out of thin air. The Americans filed reports. Their language was clipped and efficient, designed to reduce chaos to procedure. Incident during ration distribution. Female POW initiated disruption. No casualties. Recommended reevaluation of food rations. But behind the neat lines typed out by typewriters were the images that the soldiers could not shake. A corporal later admitted in his diary, "She looked half dead, but she had more fight in her than most men I've seen. Not the kind of fight we train for, the kind that refuses to let others die." That day, medical officers were called in. The nurses' actions forced the camp command to confront what they had tried to ignore. Starvation was no longer an abstraction. It had a face, thin and defiant. The doctors walked into the barracks with stethoscopes and notebooks. They weighed the women, lifted their eyelids, and pressed their fingers against their fragile wrists to count their fading pulses. Their notes were full of numbers: average weight far below baseline, severe vitamin deficiency, advanced signs of beriberi, and anemia. The women watched them with suspicion, flinching at the touch of the instruments. But slowly, as medicine was distributed, powdered milk, vitamin tablets, and quinine, the tension eased. Food rations increased. The act had startled the guards and embarrassed the officers. If one starving woman had the strength to seize a sack, then surely they could spare a few more calories per person. That week, the bowls held slightly more rice. Canned meat, which had previously been withheld, was now opened and shared. For the women, it felt like a miracle. For the Americans, however, it was a decision born of practicality, but tinged with something deeper, an unspoken acknowledgement of humanity. The guards themselves changed in small ways. Where they had once barked orders, some now gave gestures instead. Where they had once watched with cold detachment, a few now looked away when a prisoner took too long at the water barrel. One even dropped a biscuit on the ground near the fence and pretended not to notice when it was picked up. The women whispered about these moments at night, their voices fragile, yet filled with disbelief. The nurse at the center of it all remained quiet. She did not boast. She did not remind anyone of what she had done. She simply moved among the women as before, taking their temperatures, encouraging them to drink water, and sharing her own rations with the weaker ones. Yet the others watched her differently now. Some still thought her reckless. Others began to follow her example. When food arrived, it was shared more evenly. When water was scarce, they ensured the weakest drank first. The rhythm of the camp shifted from silent endurance to quiet cooperation. American medical records noted an improvement in health. The mortality rate slowed. Infants who were once too weak to cry began to make sounds again. Women who had lain motionless for days sat up. There was still hunger, but there was also survival. And survival in war was no small thing. Officers discussed the event among themselves. Some called it a fluke, a disruption not to be repeated. Others saw it differently. One lieutenant remarked, "We think discipline is what maintains order, but sometimes it's an act of defiance that shows us what we've missed." His words did not enter official files, but lingered in the minds of those who heard them. For the women, the change was less about calories than perception. The enemy had not struck her down. The guards had not fired. Instead, they had allowed the act to stand. This simple decision shattered years of fear-driven obedience. If survival could be carved out of madness once, perhaps it could happen again. Hope, once forbidden, crept back into their bodies alongside the food. In the following days, the image of rifles pointing outward became clearer. Soldiers began to stand not just as overseers, but as protectors too. Rumors circulated of Japanese stragglers moving through the jungle, desperate and dangerous, unwilling to surrender. When night fell, The silhouettes of the guards against the campfires appeared different to the women. Their weapons, which had previously been symbols of control, were now being used to keep other threats at bay. The prisoners whispered the truth they had never imagined. They felt safer with the enemy, watching the wire, than without. The nurse herself was growing weaker. She had given away too much of her own food and expended too much energy helping others. Yet, when asked why she had done what she did, she only shook her head. "Because hunger kills faster than bullets," she said softly, "and I would not let it take us all." Her actions were labeled crazy, but in its wake, rations increased, medical care improved, and discipline softened. Dozens of lives that might otherwise have slipped away quietly were saved instead. Sometimes war shifts not with orders shouted from command posts, but with a single voice breaking the silence. Sometimes the bravest act is not on the battlefield, but in the dust of a camp where a starving woman dares to remind prisoners and guards alike that survival is a choice worth fighting for. The days that followed carried the weight of change. It was neither sudden nor dramatic, like the ripping of the sack. It was slow and almost invisible at first, but it grew. The camp, which had been a place of silence and slow death, began to breathe again. The women felt it in their bones before they could voice it. Something had shifted, and it could not be undone. The first sign was the mortality curve. Before the incident, death had been steady and almost predictable. Each week, another body was carried out beyond the wire, wrapped in cloth and lowered into a shallow grave under the tropical sun. The women watched, their eyes hollow and their stomachs twisted with the fear that it might be them the next day. The guards kept lists, crossing out names with neat lines. Numbers were recorded. Lives ended in silence. Afterwards, the line slowed. Fewer names were crossed off. The week survived another day. Infants who were once too weak to cry began to whimper again, their thin voices cutting through the humid air like proof that life had not surrendered. American doctors noted this with dry precision in their logs. Improved caloric intake, mortality rate reduced. The women took note of it differently, in the sound of breathing at night and in eyes that had been closed for too long finally opening. Trust was the second sign. It did not come easily. The women had been taught from childhood that Americans were demons. They had believed every story of cruelty. Even after they were captured, they braced themselves for violence that never came. They mistrusted every gesture, every ration, and every word. But the sack of rice had changed things. They had seen the Americans hesitate, then choose mercy over punishment. The rifles stayed silent. The officer said, "Let her finish." Those words echoed louder than any propaganda. Slowly, fear began to dissipate. Women began approaching the fence, not just for water, but to communicate in broken words, gestures, and nods. Some guards responded in kind, sharing cigarettes and slipping biscuits through the gaps in the fence. A nurse among the Americans saw infants who were too weak to feed and requested powdered milk from the stores. The quartermaster hesitated, then relented. The women received it in tin cups, their hands shaking and their eyes full of disbelief. The taste was strange and foreign, but it kept the children alive. That was enough. Instead of despair, the camp took on a rhythm of survival. The women, once silent, began to hum again, faint melodies from their childhoods or whispered prayers. The sound startled even them. They had forgotten what it felt like to make noise not out of fear, but because they were alive. Guards walking the perimeter at night could hear these sounds, and some quietly admitted that they unsettled them more than silence ever had. Silence belonged to death. Humming belonged to survival. The Americans filed further reports. One officer described the event not as mutiny, but as an unusual incident of discipline turned into mercy. His language was clinical, but behind it lay something rare in war, an acknowledgement that the rules had bent towards humanity. Soldiers hardened by years of combat whispered amongst themselves about the woman who had dared to take food. Some called her foolish, others called her brave. All of them remembered. The prisoners remembered most of all. They began to see the camp differently. The barbed wire still cut the sky, but it no longer just looked like a cage. Now it looked like a line that had once been crossed when a woman defied orders and carried a sack, and nothing terrible happened. The barracks still smelled of sweat and damp straw, but now there was also the faint but real scent of rice cooking. The guards still carried rifles, but more often than not, the barrels were pointed outwards. The nurse herself did not change her demeanor. She still gave away her own rations, checked fevers with her hand, and whispered, "Not tonight," to those who wanted to give up. But in the eyes of the other women, she had become something larger than herself. They whispered her name with reverence. Some called her reckless, while others called her a savior. In their private language, her actions were recounted time and again. She carried the sack, she tore it open. They did not stop her. We ate, we lived. The effect spread beyond food. Hope crept back. Women began to plan, not escape, which was impossible, but survival until the end of the war. They spoke quietly of their families and children waiting for them somewhere, and of the villages they might see again. Such conversations had been unthinkable weeks before. Now they filled the nights. Even laughter returned in short, sharp bursts, like sparks in the dark. For the Americans, this became a lesson. They realized that mercy could stabilize situations where discipline might fail. They realized that prisoners who believed they would survive were easier to manage than those who had surrendered to despair. But more than that, they recognized something human in their enemies that training had tried to eradicate. One sergeant wrote, "We fight them in caves and they fight to the death. But here I saw someone fight for their own life and for the lives of others. I can't hate that kind of fight." The sack of rice had been a rupture, a moment of madness. Yet from it came a different kind of order, an order born not from fear, but from the shared understanding that survival was possible. The women no longer counted the days until their deaths. They counted the days towards something beyond the wire. Sometimes the smallest act can reshape the largest truths. What appeared to be chaos became a different kind of discipline. What seemed like madness became the seed of mercy. And what began as one woman's defiance became the reason why dozens of others were still alive. When the war finally ended and the gates of the camps opened permanently, the prisoners emerged into a world that no longer resembled the one they had left behind. Japan had surrendered. The empire that had once demanded their lives had collapsed. The women who had survived captivity now faced a return home filled with silence, suspicion, and shame. Among them was the nurse whose act of defiance had fed dozens in the dust. She did not walk taller than the others. She moved quietly, her frame still gaunt, and her eyes still shadowed by the weight of what she had endured. Yet those who had lived through the camp with her could not forget. Her name was rarely spoken in public. In post-war Japan, female prisoners of war were almost invisible. The culture that had taught them to fight to the death now viewed their survival as a stain. Families welcomed them with guarded faces, neighbors whispered, and communities shunned them. Many women hid their experiences for decades, burying their memories as if they were crimes. The nurse was no exception. She returned to her town with little more than the clothes she was wearing and resumed life among people who did not want to hear about her experiences. But inside the circle of former prisoners, her story survived. They whispered it when they met, in kitchens and back rooms, and in secretly exchanged letters. "Do you remember the sack?" one would ask. "Do you remember how she tore it open?" Another would answer, "Yes. Without her, I would not be alive to speak now." In their private language of survival, she was not forgotten. Some called her reckless. They said she had risked punishment for all of them and had acted without thought. Others called her brave. They said she had breathed life into them when everything else pointed to death. The truth was probably somewhere in between. Recklessness and bravery often go hand in hand, especially in war. American officers who had witnessed the act mentioned her in their reports, though never by name. One described her as a female prisoner of war who initiated an unusual ration distribution, preventing near starvation. Another wrote in his private journal, "She was crazy, but her madness made sense. She saved them, and she changed us." These fragments remained tucked away in archives, invisible to the public, for decades. The nurse herself spoke little. When asked later why she had done it, she responded with the same quiet defiance that had sustained her throughout her captivity. "Because hunger kills faster than bullets," she said, "and I would not let it take us." Those words echoed in the memories of those who heard them, an explanation that was both simple and unshakable. Her post-war life was marked by contradictions. On the surface, she lived quietly, working in a small clinic and raising a family, performing the duties expected of her. But in her silence lay the weight of memory. When she held a spoon, she remembered handfuls of rice in the dirt. When she saw a sack of grain in a market, she remembered the fabric tearing under her nails. When she heard a baby cry, she remembered the infants in the camp who were fed by trembling hands. The past was never gone. It lived in objects, sounds, and gestures. For her fellow prisoners, she became a private legend. At reunions held decades later, when the women finally found the courage to speak, her name was always the first to be mentioned. In the 1990s, one survivor told an interviewer, "I owe my life to her. She was mad, yes, but it was her madness that gave me the strength to survive." Another said, "I had lost hope. She gave it back with her hands full of rice." Historians who later pieced together these accounts recognized her actions as a rare example of the human spirit overcoming the machinery of war. Comfort stations, prison camps, and starvation were all structures designed to force individuals into silence. Her defiance showed that even within those structures, one act could have far-reaching consequences. And yet, she never claimed to be a hero. To her, it was a matter of necessity. Hunger was the enemy, and silence was surrender. She fought with the only weapon she had, courage that appeared to be madness. Her story became part of oral history, not initially recorded in books, but passed down through generations of women who had sat in the dust, who had felt rice on their tongues, who had lived because she had dared to move. They passed it on to their children and grandchildren, turning it into a lesson. Sometimes survival requires actions that seem crazy to everyone else. The outside world may never know her name. Official histories rarely record the defiance of a single prisoner in a forgotten camp. But those who were there knew. They remembered the moment when a starving woman stood up, took a sack from under the noses of armed guards, and tore it open for her fellow prisoners. They remembered the silence that followed, the rifles being lowered, and the officer saying, "Let her finish." They remembered how it felt to live another day because of her. Sometimes history is written in treaties, parades, and signatures on surrender documents, but sometimes it is written in the dust of a camp or the trembling hands of a woman who refused to stand by and watch others die. Her life after the war may have been quiet, but her legacy was not. It lived in the breaths of every woman who survived because of her. It lived in every testimony, whispered decades later. It lives on in the knowledge that, when born of mercy, madness can save more lives than reason ever could. War teaches people to see the world in absolutes. Enemies are monsters. Prisoners are shadows. Guards are faceless figures carrying rifles. Survival is reduced to numbers, calories, rations, and casualties. But in that camp, when one woman seized a sack of rice and used it to feed others at the risk of her own life, the absolutes began to crack. What replaced them was something more complicated, more human, and far more powerful. The women who ate that rice recognized this immediately. For them, her act represented more than just food. It proved that even in captivity, they had a choice. They had been told that their fate was sealed and that survival depended solely on obedience and endurance. She shattered that idea. She proved that defiance, even reckless defiance, could alter destiny. They whispered about her for days and then weeks, retelling the story until it became more than a memory. It became a legend. They called her the one who fed us, the mad nurse, the reason we are alive. The Americans learned from it too. Soldiers who had arrived hardened by years of jungle warfare suddenly saw their prisoners as more than just burdens. They saw them as human beings capable of courage and sacrifice. A sergeant later confessed, "We thought discipline meant control. That day, I realized that discipline could also mean restraint. We let her finish, and that may have been the best order we ever followed." A young medic who had treated the prisoners after the incident wrote, "She risked punishment not to save herself, but to save others. That was the first time I looked at an enemy and thought that maybe we were not so different." In the barracks, the women began to act differently. Hunger still pressed upon them, but they no longer surrendered completely to despair. Some shared food without being asked. Others cared for the weakest more attentively, following the nurse's example. Her madness had spread, not as chaos, but as compassion. The camp's atmosphere shifted from silent resignation to fragile solidarity. Historians would later describe it as a moment of humanity in an inhuman system. But for those who experienced it, the meaning was simpler. It was a reminder that survival was not only physical, but moral too. Seeing someone risk everything to protect others gave them the strength to endure. It gave them a reason to live rather than merely exist. For the Americans, it altered their perception of the enemy. They had been trained to expect fanaticism from Japanese soldiers, to believe that they would never surrender or show weakness, to believe that they would never act for the benefit of others. Yet here was a young, gaunt, starving woman who embodied sacrifice in a way that surprised even the most battle-hardened of men. Years later, one officer admitted, "I learned more about courage from that prisoner than from some of the men I fought beside." The symbolism grew stronger over time. The sack of rice became more than just food. It became a metaphor for the possibility that, even if only for a moment, war could be interrupted by mercy disguised as madness. To the prisoners, it meant life. To the guards, it represented conscience. To history, it showed that the distinction between enemy and ally could be transcended by a single act of compassion. The Japanese women carried the memory back with them after the war. Many remained silent in public, but shared their stories with their families in private. Children and grandchildren grew up hearing fragments of the story. There was a woman. She was called crazy. She saved us. These half-legend, half-history words shaped how later generations understood captivity. It was not just suffering, it was also resistance. Not resistance with weapons, but courage that defied logic. The Americans carried the story home, too. Some wrote letters about it, while others told comrades over drinks after the war. For many, it became the most vivid memory of their guard duty, not the endless patrols or the paperwork, but the sight of a starving woman tearing open a sack and distributing rice with trembling hands. In the archives, the incident survived only in sparse reports. Female POW seized rations and distributed them to a group. No violence. Situation resolved. The bureaucratic language stripped it of weight, but those who had witnessed it knew the truth. It was one of the most powerful moments of the war, not because of destruction, but because of preservation, not because of death, but because of life. The nurse never sought recognition. Her act was not planned as a symbol. It was instinct, born of desperation and compassion. Yet that is why it endured. Symbols are often created by history in hindsight, but true symbols are forged in the crucible of reality. Her act became a mirror in which both prisoners and guards saw something unexpected, their own humanity. Ultimately, her crazy act saved more than just dozens of starving women. It proved that even in the darkest corners of war, choices mattered. It showed that mercy could exist even between sworn enemies. It proved that survival sometimes depends not on reason, but on defiance that seems insane until it succeeds. War is sometimes remembered for its battles and treaties. But the most important moment is sometimes a sack of rice being torn open in silence, guarded by uncocked rifles. The image that remained was not of victory parades or surrender ceremonies. Rather, it was of a woman kneeling in the dust, her hands trembling and her body frail, the torn sack spilling rice around her like scattered pearls. Behind her, dozens of women crouched low, clutching the food as though it were life itself. Surrounding them were soldiers with lowered rifles, silent and watching. Their discipline had not been broken by chaos, but by compassion. This moment did not make the headlines. No official report described the sound of women chewing rice through tears or infants being fed by sticky fingers and beginning to cry again with voices thought lost. No general speech praised the courage of the prisoner who had risked punishment to keep others alive. Yet for those who were there, that image became more vivid than any medal, flag, or anthem. The war was vast, filled with battles that shook continents. But within that context, survival often depended on small, invisible acts. A soldier carrying a wounded comrade off a beach, a nurse slipping a quinine tablet into the palm of a patient with a fever, a guard looking away as food changed hands. In one forgotten camp, a young Japanese prisoner tore open a sack of rice. For the women, this became a story that was retold for decades. They did not speak of her as a hero in the grand sense, but as someone who refused to remain silent. They remembered the sound of her steady, defiant voice, commanding them to eat. They remembered the way her hands moved not towards her own mouth, but outwards, dividing and sharing, insisting that everyone take something. They remembered the shock when the guards did not fire, and the order came to let her finish. That was the sound of survival. For the Americans, this became a lesson buried deeper than combat training. They had been taught to see enemies, but what they saw was humanity. They had been prepared to punish, but they chose mercy instead. Ultimately, they learned that restraint can be the bravest action of all. History often forgets names. The nurse's name may never be written in textbooks. However, the women she saved carried her memory in their bodies, their children, and the generations that followed. Every life preserved that day became a thread in the fabric of the future. What seemed like madness at the time became apparent as sanity with hindsight. What seemed reckless became necessary. The image is simple: a torn sack, trembling hands, lowered rifles, and tears mingling with dust. It is not an image of conquest, it is an image of endurance. Sometimes the most significant actions in war are not those that destroy, but those that preserve. Sometimes the bravest soldiers do not carry rifles, they carry rice. Sometimes the line between life and death is not drawn by strategy, but by a seemingly crazy act of defiance against despair. And so the final truth lingers, carried by the survivors, whispered by guards, recorded in fragments, and remembered in the quiet corners of history. Mercy can look like madness, but when born of compassion, madness can save the world.